So, hello, I'm Haley, and I am the technical manager for this session entitled the Gender Responsive Policy Analysis Tool for Food Systems. And we have some amazing facilitators here today that will be presenting and sharing insights with us. But we really thank you for taking part in ANH 2025, and we look forward to a very engaging, robust, and interactive session. So thanks so much for joining, and I will kick it over to our facilitators.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this Learning Lab. Yes, as I said, you're very welcome to this Learning Lab. We'll be talking about the gender responsive policy analysis tool for food systems today. And I will start by introducing my co-facilitators.
Yeah, hi everyone. Sorry for that. Caroline Ewonya team. I'm based in Uganda and I work with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition as the gender advisor for the Africa portfolio. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. If you wanted to introduce yourself, Nora.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Nora Lisa Aberman. I also with GAIN, Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and I lead our research team on food systems governance and inclusion. Really nice to be with everyone today. Thanks.
Thank you, Nora. I'm Valentine Granet. I work with GAIN as well. I'm based in the UK and I am the global gender advisor for GAIN, working across our different portfolios. So just wanted to first present the session plan a little bit. So we're going through the introduction now. We'll be looking at the background of the GRIP tool, how it came to be, and why we developed this tool. And then we'll have an interactive presentation looking at the GRIP tool structure itself. And finally, we want to look at what happens after we have conducted a GRIP tool analysis, how to take up and apply the results of the GRIP tool. A main point that I wanted to highlight today is that we want the session to be as interactive as possible. We hope that you will learn from it, but we also hope to learn from you. So we'd love to hear about your experiences. We'd love to hear about your thoughts. So please, do feel free to write messages in the chat. I see some people are introducing themselves already, so thank you for that. Please do put your hands up, share your experiences, your knowledge, do ask questions. We want this to go, we want this to be as interactive as it possibly can. Yeah, so I think this echoes a lot of what you've said, right? That policymakers, and I know what some of Nilofer said about policymakers not always being aware of gender considerations and the distinct needs and preferences of men and women, that there are oftentimes cultural norms that not only limit women's participation, but also how much they can benefit from food systems. And then finally, that women's voices are very often excluded from policy decisions. So all these observations lead us to the importance of addressing gender barriers in food policy. Right, so just a little bit to contextualize how the GRIP tool came to be. GAIN has a large program that is called Nourishing Food Pathways, which is all about supporting inclusive and coherent food system transformation across 10 different countries. This builds on the UN Food System Summit, which I'm sure you're all aware of, and specifically the National Food System Transformation Pathways, so those commitments that countries made to how they want to shape their food systems looking forward. A big part of this work is to work closely with governments to support policy evolution. So this meant that there was really interesting opportunities for GAIN to support the development of emerging food system policies, to make those policies more gender responsive as they are being developed, reviewed, and emerging. So what that meant is that we wanted to have a policy analysis tool to analyze specific documents and to identify what we'll call priority policy areas, and we'll get more into what that means exactly, but to really target at a point in time policy documents which will be implemented in the coming months or years and which will shape food systems in all those different countries. So just a little bit of the technical side of things, but just to say, as we're all aware, there's lots of other tools out there, and we have the GRIP tool has been informed by several of these tools. We've looked at the GBA Plus, which is an analytical tool from the Government of Canada, which really focuses on intersectionality, so that idea of thinking about different identities or different contexts that people are in and how that impacts how food systems impact them. the GBA Plus also looks at the context and factors which influence policies, and it advocates for different consultations and inclusion of different voices. But it isn't a tool that's designed for policy analysis in the sense that it's not about reviewing a particular policy document and analyzing it. And then there's the WeAreGov, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is about women's empowerment in agri-food system governance. So the goal of this approach is really to enhance women's voice and agency, which isn't exactly what we're trying to do here. With the group tool, we're really trying to address gender barriers in how food systems are developed and how they function. And then we want to mention the Reach Benefit Empower Normalize framework, which isn't, again, a policy analysis tool as such, but it highlights the need for really concrete actions, which I've heard a lot of you mention already today, and really looking at outcomes in terms of gender equality and people benefiting from different areas of the food system. And then finally, there's the GAPO from the FAO, which also highlights the importance of consultation, validation processes, and you'll see that's been very much integrated into the group tool. And it also looks at gender responsiveness, but it's got a lot more of a focus on agriculture and rural context. And it's also operating sometimes at different levels than the work that we do here. So very briefly, some of the key elements that we needed in the group tool was those main 4 elements. So 2 levels of analysis. As you'll see, we look at both the contextual analysis of how the document was developed, the context around the document, and then we look specifically at the text of the document, the policy document, and have a desk review element. Then there's a really important element of aligning with government priorities, right? And we talked about those different priorities and how they might not inherently include gender at the beginning, but the idea is really to align those recommendations that we make with broader government priorities and their goals. And then there was an important theoretical framing. We talk about gender barriers. We'll get a little bit more into what we mean by that exactly. But this idea that in order to address inequalities or lack of equality in food systems, we need to address the gender barriers that are the cause for it. And then finally, this element of really being very grounded in stakeholder input, in those policy dialogues, consultations, engagement, validation. That's a really important element as well. So that'll be on to Carol then. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Valentine, and thanks for giving us this brief about how the group tool came about, and we will still encourage members to keep sharing your thoughts in the chat about it. My session will be to take you through what the group tool is, what it does, and what are the different components. So the group tool is made up of 3 components that we will be looking at, like Valentine has discussed about it. So the group tool identifies opportunities to make policies more gender responsive without imposing any solutions. And like we have looked at the different tools that have been looked at, so that we are able to have one tool that is able to contextualize the food systems. It looks at 3 components, and the first component basically looks at identifying the background and the context of the policy. For example, if the policy is looking at agricultural policy to increase productivity and adapt to climate change, what is the context in such a scenario? Then it also looks at a second component that looks at gender barriers that manifest, and we see that one of the tools really looks at what are the different barriers that exist and how the policy document responds to them. And an example of this is, for example, still following like agriculture, if the context in the area is that women do not have access or control over productive resources, like I see Doris has posted in the chat, and are often at risk of losing that land or farm, we see that the policy may be ignoring this kind of inequality, because they know women participate in productivity, like we have seen from the context of Tanzania, from Pakistan, from Nigeria. So if that is, if the policy ignores the inequality, then to reach the goal for the policy, women have to have access and control. So bringing in the idea of having gender-friendly policies is really something that is good. And the last component is to support context-specific solutions. And so like we are saying that we identify the different barriers and go further to look at what are they in context according to the different countries. And again, in our discussions, we've seen Nigeria, women are participating in the whole value chain, but the challenge is at decision making. So how do we contextualize our policy at that level? So it's able to identify policy priority areas and engage stakeholders so that when they are designing, when they are reviewing the different policies, or even when they are trying to state new policies or implement them, they put all these solutions into context. And in this case, we are looking at these barriers in terms of legal, socioeconomic, or institutional factors that may cause unequal opportunities or outcomes based on the gender of the individuals. So to dive deeper into component one, and like I've told you, is that we are basically gathering information about the context of the drivers and the stakeholders. What is their positioning while developing these different policies or reviewing the policies. And in that, in relation to food systems, we see different countries have different policies. It may be on nutrition, maybe on agriculture, some policies on gender that all feed into food systems. So looking at how are they assessing, looking at gender at different levels. So the component provides giving questions to support the analysis and gathering of contextual information in general from the different sources of information that are there. And this, it gives an opportunity to engage relevant stakeholders to gather different perspectives and expertise in the context. So much of the work here is done through key informant interviews among the stakeholders, the farmers, the policymakers. We also engage the universities and in different consultations on relevant people who participate in this area. So the details of component one and the questions will basically be derived from a step of identifying the key issues. What are the different gender and diversity considerations that the policy is looking at, understanding the broader context of the government priorities. Is it in agriculture? What are they? Are they social? Are they cultural? Are they economic or environment? Is it important in it? It also challenges assumptions to which the policy is being developed, looking at how has the policy been designed and how does it shape the different outcomes. And then information is later gathered through consultations with the key stakeholders, and that helps us to identify the different gaps that do exist. So when that is done, then component two, after component 2 and 3 are done, then we could be able to gather then more information to develop options and identify priority areas, which are still, which questions in component 1 will be able to answer. How do we communicate, like identify your target audiences who are influential in making sure that we are able to push these stereotypes, to push these factors that have been identified of gender into policy rated, and how are they going to be monitored? So looking at the barriers, and we have really discussed the different barriers and shared our country context. So the second component, we then go to look at the policy at its face value and see how are these barriers identified, how do they manifest? And the first step is to identify how the barrier types play out in practice and in the context of the policy. And then the policy documents the responses to the barrier, which has been examined, revealing its potential challenges and and the inequalities that may come up. And finally, the last step is to identify which of the 4 categories the policy responds to or falls in. So we find that some policies reinforce, because you may talk about women have to own participate in production of food, but you'll find when the policy talks about it, and they should be able to access inputs, but these inputs are given to the men. So you'll find that it's trying to reinforce gender, or it is ignoring that women are participants in production or in the processing or in the marketing or in decisions of making the policies. And then it also looks at, it's able to see, does the policy recognize gender? Does it recognize that actually there is this barrier and we should be able to address it in the final state? So these are the different barriers, the legal barriers, like we have looked at, the norms, like we have shared from our different contexts, mobility, among others. So in conclusion, with what component 2 basically looks at, component 2 tries to really pick out how policies reinforce, ignore, recognize, or address the different gender barriers that are there. And these barriers are 7. They could be legal. We've discussed them in detail, like we've talked about the land, which has to start maybe from the government or even within the cultural settings, restrictive gender norms that we say women don't own land, or women should be eating last. We've heard from Pakistan telling us that the policies say maybe some of the unwritten rules, barriers are that women should be eating last. And so maybe they eat least and the non-nutrient. We have barriers on access and control of assets, technology and information. We have education through maybe the trainings. You decide to have your training on using technology. We have safety and security barriers and well-being. So that is what component 2 really tries to dig deeper. And with this component, we are able to analyze and get solutions. So for example, in Pakistan, we can see maybe when they are analyzing the agricultural productivity in Pakistan, there is a barrier, for example, of access and control of assets and technology information. And in the context of Pakistan, we see that women play a role in agriculture, yet have limited access to inputs, technology, and information, and this limits productivity. Yet we are saying, the government is saying there should be increased productivity. So the current policy response is the policy document, which is reviewed, the agricultural policy, says that there should be investment in agricultural productivity, but do not mention women's role in agriculture or their contribution. And it further has no mention of including women in receiving input. So when we conclude such a policy, we see that this policy ignores the barrier, has a barrier of ignoring. That's the policy response, and the priority action is if women would be included in the trainings and in the provision of inputs. So in conclusion, or looking at the 3rd component of the tool, is now further digging deeper into the identified priorities. And these are got in component 1, which contextualizes the thoughts behind the policy and the barriers which have been identified, majorly the ones that reinforce or ignore gender. And so different priorities are identified, opportunities are made or shared, and these are later discussed with the different stakeholders to contextualize and have policy dialogues. How can these recommendations be solved? And so the policy then goes further to develop policy recommendations that a country or a different policy can use to review what is already there, so that the policies are more responsive and include are able to include both the women and male distinct needs. So thank you so much. Over to you, Nora.
Great. Thanks a lot, Carol. In the interest of prioritizing interaction, I'll go through our results quite quickly, and then we can share details if you'd like. So we've applied this tool through our NFP Nourishing Food Pathways program that is across 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Um, it actually might be more than 10 countries. We've kind of added a couple. And this is our first application was in Pakistan, so I'll present those results. So the desk review component, Carol just went through this. I like to think of it as kind of identifying those opportunities for gender responsive policy changes, actions. Another way to think about it is what are the policy windows? Because this is really grounded in what does the government say? These are their current priorities based on these policy documents, which in this case, I'll get to where it was, what was analyzed. But what are the policy windows that feed into government priorities? And we can kind of say this is a win-win. Let's make this more gender responsive and it will support your own needs. And then we engage with stakeholders to turn them into these context specific recommendations by those stakeholders in country. So we undertook, by we, I'll say Valentine, who developed led the development of this tool and undertook the desk review analysis for the Pakistan example. After coming up with these opportunities, our policy advisor in country and some really great policy consultants brought together 30 country experts from ministries, academia, and civil society, and in particular identified who are the key kind of influencers, advocates, people working already on gender and food systems, and make sure that they're there to engage with government and others on this issue. A set of these policy recommendations were identified and compiled in a policy brief, which is co-authored in theory by the government of Pakistan and being reviewed as um, an output of this process, which kind of represents a prioritization or a recognition of these recommendations that came out of this stakeholder engagement. And that tells us that there's been some uptake, essentially, some understanding, recognition, change in how the government is thinking about or prioritizing these issues. So I won't go through all of these for the sake of time. I want to get to our interactive um, slides, activities. But this is a kind of an organization of some of the bigger priority areas that reflect on Pakistan's context. What are the kind of policy openings? What are the context specific challenges? What's been tried and didn't work or is kind of missing some element? I can let me just look at norms and behaviors where it was raised that everything from media campaigns that challenge the ideas that men eat first or making nutrition messages more inclusive would support kind of shifts in these underlying norms and behaviors that restrict food systems policy actions from being more effective. Additionally, I'll go through another one. So in education and literacy, there's a big issue that a lot of the nutrition information assumes that people can read, but nearly half of adult women in Pakistan can't. So things like food labels, visual food labels were presented. Written food labels was a potential policy action, But some of the suggestions that came out were to make these kind of visual, something you can see without having to read, things like community theater engagement, or other kind of content platforms to the extent that women have access to technology.
I just wanted to thank you so much for being present and engaging with us today. Please do feel free also to reach out and to share any additional information with us. This tool should be shared on our website and published shortly, as Nora said. So yeah, thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks for everyone for joining, and special thank you to the facilitators as well. And please just have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.